Well, welcome back, folks. You're a resilient bunch. This is yet another lecture in this longer series of lectures to do with education and the pursuit of wisdom, and how we need to do that if we're even going to begin to explore education as something that should be creative. Not just creative for the students, but creative for you too. It should be creativity is a wonderful thing. But we started this lecture, this long series, looking at Sir Ken Robinson's TED Talks and these sorts of things about creativity, and just throwing some questions at it and saying, well, okay, Ken, that sounds really great, but what about this? I just imagine Socrates sitting in the audience and talking with Ken. I mean, Ken's such a funny guy, right? When you see him talk, or you see him on a TED Talk or whatever, he's a nice guy too, but I think he'd probably maybe lose his patience with Socrates. That's kind of what we're doing all this time. Anyway, we just finished talking about Thomas Aquinas and some of the medieval views of education, and the pursuit of wisdom, what wisdom is. What I want to do now is just move along and talk about Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. Probably the lion's share of you have run into this. I know if you're in my class, you were instructed on this. It's a pretty important structure. Everybody who goes through a Bachelor of Education program pretty much is taught about Benjamin Bloom and this taxonomy. What is a taxonomy? Taxonomy is a kind of a funny, jargony word, but really it comes from two Greek words. One is taxis and one is nomos. So taxis has to do with order, right? And nomos has to do with law or custom. So it's like think of it this as it's like a customary ordering of thought in this case, right? So cognitive taxonomies, there's affective taxonomies. He has a psychomotor taxonomy, which we're not going to discuss. Anyway, the last lecture, I showed you, I made a diagram of it, a big yellow and black diagram. It looks like a bumblebee. Anyway, I showed you this ancient taxonomy that Thomas Aquinas takes from earlier thinkers, and he helps us explore the meaning of thinking, contemplation, and talks about the different varieties of contemplation. I think it's a really valuable taxonomy. Anyway, I showed you that one because obviously I don't think you'd be too familiar with that one, but Bloom's, probably all of us know. Everybody knows that. Whenever you sit down to make a test for your kids, or you're designing an assessment task for your kids in your classroom, you're going to be using Bloom, right? You're just going to be checking and seeing how's my lesson planning stand in relation to the sorts of Bloomian levels of questioning that that we're all expected to adhere to. So anyway, here we go. Contemplation and Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. The most popularized and standard model for considering the manner in which thinking forms a hierarchy in current educational practice is detailed in Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. All new teachers are taught that they must ensure that the student learning in their classes incorporates thought processes at each of the levels identified by Bloom, and following is ordering. Moreover, as teachers, we're all instructed that our modes of classroom assessment must measure learning across these objects, or these educational objectives, right? And Bloom lists 6 such objectives in the cognitive domain, from the lowest to the highest rank as knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. In the second portion of his taxonomy, which deals with the affective domain, he lists 5 strata: from least to greatest. So at the bottom you've got receiving, responding, valuing, organization, all the way up to characterization by a value or a value complex. That's a kind of a funny one. And again, he has this other one, the psychomotor taxonomy, or the psychometer, I don't know, tomato, whatever. But we're not going to look at that one. So here are some, here's a slide that just lays those out for you in probably ways that you're familiar with as a teacher. And again, you'd sit down with this beside you, just double checking as you're making your lessons. And it's good practice, right? When I'm making a lesson, and is everything that I'm doing just asking the kids just to puke back knowledge towards me, or facts, or what year was the War of 1812 or something like that, or am I asking them comprehension questions, right? Am I seeing whether they understand things, what they're reading in that regard? Am I getting them to apply the knowledge that they're ostensibly gaining in my class? Are they analyzing? Are they able to pick things apart? Or synthesizing? Are they able to put things together? And then evaluating, are they able to say, is that good? Or is that right? Or is it true? Or whatever, right? And same with the affective taxonomy too. We'll talk more about that. So, from what you've already learned in this class, you can see that Thomas's medieval taxonomy depicts a broader amplitude in terms of both cognition, thinking, and affectation, or willing. For instance, Bloom's cognitive taxonomy reaches its apex in the evaluation of propositions according to their logical consistency, their avoidance of fallacious reasoning, and by how well they measure up to accepted cultural and disciplinary standards. However, from what we have thus far seen in our own study of thinking and the contemplative life in relation to wisdom, this supposed apex of cognition is quite a low summit that does not recognize the full amplitude of our cognitive abilities and cognizable reality. All right, so if you want to go back to the previous lecture and just look at that other taxonomy that Aquinas offers us, you can compare the two. For starters, Bloom's taxonomy does not carefully distinguish between the mind's powers of ratio and intellectus, two terms we discussed earlier. Rather, his discussion of cognition emphasizes ratio at the expense of intellectus, which, if it shows up anywhere, is accorded some degree of recognition at the lowest level of cognition identified by Bloom, perhaps as basic knowledge or simple grasping of the axiomatic. However, among the ancients and medievals, intellectus was always ranked more highly than ratio as a superior form of knowing because it grasps its object directly. Intellectus, as we have already discussed it, is a power of the mind or mens, whereby the knower grasps what is known without resort to discursive reasoning. Discursive reasoning is what we call ratio, see? Bloom's simple knowing of facts and dates, of axioms and principles, is in some way related to intellectus as a basic form of immediate grasping of what is given. And yet, Bloom's sense of knowing at this very basic and lowest level is also distinct from intellectus. For Bloom correctly sees that one can know facts yet not understand them in their greater significance. One can know, by rote memorization for instance, a range of data that one has been taught without ever having questioned its truth or significance or established its meaningfulness dialectically. Intellectus, on the other hand, is most often translated as understanding. And it is precisely this sense of intellectus that's clearly not intended by Bloom at such a low level of learning. His taxonomy deigns to offer us a coherent and comprehensive elucidation of the full amplitude of cognition in its correct order. But in reality, he accounts for only ratio as a power of mens, leaving intellectus out of his cognitive taxonomy entirely. Okay? Even dismissing his silence concerning intellectus, Bloom's elucidation of ratio is itself problematic. At the highest level, the evaluative level of cognition, our rational powers are described by Bloom as judging by pre-established cultural and disciplinary criteria. On the one hand, evaluation, according to Bloom's taxonomy, proceeds by inspection of things thought according to internal evidence. That is, by examining how systematically coherent and logically consistent are the objects of thinking. Does everything fit together, right? On the other hand, in addition to the criteria of internal consistency, one might include here logic and deductive reasoning, evaluative thinking also considers whether or not the objects of thought accord with the external criteria of cultural understanding, societal norms and values, and the highest available standards in any field of study. Okay, so for Bloom, it doesn't seem to be the case that evaluation may proceed without recourse to basic acceptance of some pre-existent set of acknowledged principles, axioms, cultural beliefs, or values, right? It's just swallowing down some value set, some system of beliefs or something like that, or contrary to that, it's just whatever is the best rationale or reasoning in the field, that's what you start with for Bloom, see? Indeed, judgment according to these beliefs or values appears to be the basis for all evaluative thinking in Bloom's taxonomy. So I'm trying to say to you guys that noetic cognition is unaccounted for in Bloom's taxonomy. This idea of noesis, again, we discussed that back when we were talking about basic terms in this lecture series. So you can look that up if you've forgotten or you skipped that bit. Using the terminology we've gleaned from ancient and medieval philosophy, we may say that Bloom's elucidation of evaluative cognition is restricted to dianoetic operations. It doesn't rise to the level of noetic activity. To recapitulate, dianoia, that's a Greek word for thought, is that form of cognitive activity that reasons downward from the axioms or the principles of any given discipline or field of study. Now, again, what I mean by downward is, I don't know, it's maybe a weak word there, but it just means whatever the axioms or first principles or whatever it is in, say, biology or science or physics or math or whatever, right? Whatever they are, you take those and you apply them into the world somehow, right? You build something with it, you create something with it, you put things together, you take things apart with it, that sort of thing, right? So it's an application. Dianoia takes these axiomata, or these axioms, and these archai, or these principles, and applies them in the operations of the various arts and sciences. Dianoetic thought, in any science or art, might also recognize when a given idea or application conflicts with the principles fundamental to its particular branch of study. So, in other words, something comes up, you're a scientist, say, studying physics, somebody says something in physics, and you're like, that doesn't sound right because of this, this, and this, right? You already know the basics of physics, and what that person just said, or what they are suggesting doesn't fit with that, so you know that something is up, right? This dianoetic mode of evaluating data, according to the established first principles of the various disciplines, accords well with the evaluative level of learning in Bloom's taxonomy. However, Bloom's explanation of our evaluative capacities doesn't reveal any clear evidence of awareness of the element of noesis or intellection in cognition. Noesis, unlike dianoia, does not apply reason downward. See, there's my little yellow arrow there, right, with dianoia on it. It doesn't apply it downward from the various archai, but rather takes these archai themselves upward. This is anhiresis. Anhiresis is a word that means to take up. It, as far as I know, I can tell is that it was a word used by Homer. So, there's this big battle in the Iliad, and all these people are slaughtered. And when you take a dead body up out of the field, they use this word anhiresis, right? Or anhireomai. So the arrow there, upward. For example, right? Suppose you're starting with something like, justice, right? So in Plato's Republic, you've got one of the axioms or principles that they start with. Socrates asks one of the fellas, what's justice? And he says, it's minding your own business, right? Or it's the idea that friends have everything in common or something like that, right? So there's your basic first principle. And when you take it up, you interrogate it, right? You ask, okay, well, how does that first principle stand in relation to the truth? You pick it apart and you find out where its origin is, or how you measure it over against the good or against truth, something like that. See, so this is one thing that you'll see time and time again in Plato's dialogues, right? They'll ask a question, what's virtue? Or they'll ask, what's justice? They'll ask, what's piety? There's another one, right? In the Euthyphro, piety. And, somebody will say it is X, and that becomes your first principle. And you just test it, right? You ask and you say, okay, well, where does this, how does this work? How do we understand this in relation to the good or truth itself or something like that? Okay? So noesis, unlike dianoia, doesn't apply reasoning downward from the various principles, but rather takes these archai themselves upward. The various axioms and principles of the disciplines and fields of knowledge are themselves tested, questioned, and taken up dialectically toward their true beginning and source in the divine archai. Philosophic inquiry, or the pursuit of wisdom, takes noesis as its primary mode of cognition. So, unlike Bloom's evaluative thinking, the noetic operations of philosophy transcend the principles, or the archai, as they are both given in cultural beliefs and in the highest available standards of the various arts and scientific disciplines, and the theories that are built from them. Theories in quotation marks. Whenever the cognitive activity of noesis is engaged, so whenever we're doing this, that is, whenever the mind reaches out for the ground of all its knowing and the source of all that's knowable, right? So, you and I, we love beauty, right? We see something beautiful. We see a beautiful child playing in a park. It just stirs our hearts and we smile. We're like smiling like idiots, right? We see the child and we think, oh my God, beauty, such goodness. And something in us leaps, right? Something in us leaps out. And it's just like, wow, where is this beauty? What is this? What is the ground of this beauty? What is this beauty? This beauty is so beautiful. It makes us almost feel like it points outside of itself towards something else. It makes us hungry for more than that, right? That is a kind of a noetic urge, folks. It's something that reaches up to know the ground of all beauty itself, right? Or something like that. It's kind of what the Greeks are talking about. That's what the term generally means. And you do this in your heart. You do this, your mind seeking after loving truth, loving goodness, loving beauty. Okay? So whenever the cognitive activity of noesis is engaged, that is, whenever the mind reaches out for the ground of all its knowing and the source of all that is knowable, the axiomatic is itself judged dialectically according to its relation to the first beginning or arche, which itself is grasped at the apex of noetic activity in the contemplative gaze. And we talked about that theoria, right? In this regard, Bloom's taxonomy is vastly deficient as a complete depiction of the full amplitude of the cognitive domain. It's wholly concerned with the ratio, at the expense of any awareness of the intellectus. While accounting for the Noetic elements of cognition, it lacks any concern or recognition of the important role of noesis, the primary mode of pursuing wisdom. Okay? However, Bloom's explanation of our evaluative capacities doesn't reveal any clear evidence of awareness of the element of noesis in cognition. Noesis, unlike dianoia, does not apply reason downward from the various principles, but rather takes these reasons, or rather principles themselves upward. The various axioms, did I go backwards instead of forwards? I did. My apologies. Bloom's inversion in his cognitive taxonomy. Apart from its deficient amplitude, Bloom's cognitive taxonomy, literally his customary ordering, also appears to be disordered, if not in some respects inverted hierarchically. The problems with Bloom's ordering of the educational objectives are evident if we carefully consider it in light of the ancient and medieval taxonomies we are studying. The most obvious difficulty is that Bloom's lowest taxonomic level is called knowledge. According to ancient thought, however, knowledge is not properly what one starts with, but rather what one aims at in one's desire to know. Hence, Bloom's taxonomy seems to be inverted hierarchically with regard to knowledge. Okay, that's one thing that when I was first learning about Bloom's taxonomy, it immediately caught my eye. It seemed a little bit fishy to me, and I think it probably seems a little bit fishy to you too. So a question, is knowledge to be found at the beginning and lowest level taxonomically, or is it found only at the highest summit? In his dialogue, the Meno, Plato points out that just as one could never speak out what is wholly unknown to oneself without in some sense knowing of it beforehand, so too would no one ever desire to know anything if one already knew what one sought to know. The very fact of our seeking to know implies both knowledge and ignorance. In ancient thought, then, no one who seeks to know is truly ignorant inasmuch as we seek to know. We know at least that we do not know. And more than this, by following Plato's discussion of recollection or anamnesis in the Meno, there is also the notion that we can come to know that what we come to know we have always in some sense known through participation in what we have earlier in this study termed originary experiences. If you want, folks, there's an earlier lecture that I did, a series of earlier lectures on Plato's Meno. This might help you when we're thinking about what's meant by originary experiences here. Essentially, though, our coming to know is best characterized as a kind of recollection of what we have always known to be the case, simply by our participation in the order of being. Our anamnetic knowing, following Plato's account, is simply the development of our consciousness of the fact and reality of this metalepsis, this participation. In short, although it is certainly the case that our desire to know presupposes knowledge even at the lowest level, it's equally true that knowledge is not to be found at the beginning, but rather at the end point of our inquiries. In this regard, Bloom's taxonomy of cognition strikes us as founded upon a perplexing inversion and denigration of the term knowledge. A little bit here about Bloom's confusions in his affective taxonomy. So we've moved on from the cognitive one to the affective one. If the term knowledge seems not to be the appropriate name for what is lowest but rather highest in a properly ordered cognitive taxonomy, so too does it seem to be the case that Bloom's affective taxonomy suffers an inversion of order with regard to his judgments concerning the significance of attention on the one hand and value consistency on the other. So there's the pyramid. You can study that if you want. Pause it and look at it. You can see attention at the bottom, value consistency at the top. You can see how everything's organized here on this next slide. How, what each term means according to Bloom's own criteria. This is just taken out of his work. You can read that. Pause the screen if you need to read through the various levels of the taxonomy. So I'm just going to focus here on Bloom's understanding of attention at the lowest level. At the lowest level, in the affective domain, Bloom places willingness to receive or attend to the existence of phenomena and stimuli. Now, certainly it is the case that consciousness or awareness is a basic attribute of all sentient life, and so can be reasonably classified as a low capability, right? Bloom's not full of crap, that's true. But isn't attention also what's highest? Think of all these authors we've studied and how everybody is saying attention is the be-all and the end-all of education. However, as we've seen throughout our investigation of wisdom's pursuit, there is a higher sense to attentive awareness that must be acknowledged. The ancients and medievals refer to this attentive gaze, this receptive awareness, as theoria, or contemplatio, as the manner in which the highest object of knowing is ultimately grasped. It is the sort of attention or awareness that is the mainstay of philosophy as the pursuit of wisdom. And all education worthy of the name is concerned with cultivating precisely this form of attention. In this regard, attention is not rightly conceived of as the lowest form of attention or affectation, as Bloom contends, but rather its most sublime element. In short, by inspecting ancient and medieval taxonomies, we become cognizant of those elements of cognition and affection that transcend Bloom's taxonomy. And we find reasons for asserting that Bloom's taxonomy is itself an inversion of the true order of the soul and its affective domain. Well, what about this thing, value consistency? Last time we saw anything to do with values, we were looking at some of the modern views on wisdom, that Berlin paradigm, you'll recall. They use the word value a heck of a lot when they talk about wisdom. So Bloom's talking about value consistency here as the apex of the affective domain. As a second inversion of order, can be seen if we examine Bloom's ranking of value consistency as highest among the objectives of the affective domain. In order to understand what Bloom means by this phrase, it's necessary to retrace his steps backward through the lower strata of his taxonomy of the affective domain towards the higher. After attention or awareness and obedience, the first and second tiers, Bloom places valuing, or the recognition that a thing, a phenomenon, or a behavior has worth. The indicator for Bloom that this affective objective has been reached is that our actions follow consistently from our acceptance of a value or belief in which we have developed a degree of certainty or conviction At the fourth level, Bloom places the organization of these values into a coherent and internally consistent system. The fifth and highest affective objective, according to Bloom, is that our actions and behaviors are in harmony with the system, that the individual acts consistently in accordance with the values he has internalized. The peak of effective achievement for Bloom is the coherent development of one's own worldview. Worldview is a word that you hear everywhere in school, isn't it? So, Bloom's taxonomy of the affective domain is problematic on many levels if we compare it to the ancient and medieval models we have been studying. Don't forget, wisdom's pursuit unhinges certainty and acts as a brake on action. This is what we're trying to contend here. Number 1, awareness of reality at the primary level need not be understood at a higher level to give rise to convictions and certainty, which then must cement into values, let alone systems of values. Does that mean that you're all learned up, that you're educated, that you have a system, you have a value system, right? You have certainty, you have convictions? How many people do you know that are stunned as a bag of hammers, who are full of convictions and certainty about things, and they have a whole system of understanding, right? Rather, from the philosophic vantage point wherein wisdom is pursued, it's precisely our originary awareness of the anamnetic that inspires us to seek after what we do not know and to question what we supposed we knew when in fact we did not. It's not about certainty, it's about becoming perplexed, see? Philosophic movement up the hierarchy and the affective domain does not properly resolve itself in the solidification of values or in the creation of a system of values, but it is rather the manner whereby all values are themselves brought into question. In this regard, the pursuit of wisdom as it relates to activities spawned from the will and the affective domain does not necessarily resolve itself into actions consistent and in accordance with such values. Nietzsche called philosophy the transvaluation of all values, didn't he? Rather, wisdom's pursuit most often will serve as a brake against all such actions proceeding from systematization or the application of convictions arising from a worldview. Essentially, the highest level of Bloom's affective taxonomy is a complete inversion of the proper ordering of the soul from an ancient and medieval perspective. He is at back-asswards, ladies and gentlemen. Such convictions and action, according to a coherent worldview, might actually serve to undermine or deny or subvert our awareness of reality at the primary level, when the value of our convictions is taken as what is real, and when the real that one knows through attentive awareness is forsaken in favor of the system's internal consistency. You know, think about Nazism, right? There's a system of thought, but, you know, in as much as you swallow down a Nazi ideology, you don't see the world around you. You don't see the people for people. You don't see certain people as humans at all, do you? You only see those parts of reality that you're allowed to see, really. So having a worldview, having a series of convictions that are organized into a system that ostensibly gives your life some value is a bunch of horse shit, really. Okay? All right, so I want to just think about Bloom's taxonomy over against the 6-part medieval taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy of learning objectives drives the way that we teach and that we understand learning in today's classroom. As we have seen, this taxonomy has serious deficiencies. We can see even more clearly some of its deficiencies if we look specifically at Thomas's 6-part cognitive or contemplative taxonomy already discussed. Here it is again here, right? Bloom's taxonomy certainly recognizes the consideration of corporeal things in the imagination at the first level in Thomas's ordering, see? Similarly, the second level and third level of cognition are acknowledged by Bloom, wherein the order and disposition of sensible things is considered, and invisible things are considered by means of their image, invisible things. So Bloom, too, is able to account in his taxonomy for the fourth level in the medieval taxonomy, at which intelligible things reached by the senses are considered in their own right. At the fifth level, Bloom's ordering also seems able to consider intelligible things that cannot be reached through the things of the sense, but only understood by reason. Noetic thinking, or radio, that is stressed by Bloom, can certainly extend into this territory of cognition. But at the sixth level, in which intelligible things are considered that the intellect can neither discover nor exhaust, the sublime contemplation of truth wherein contemplation is finally perfected, Bloom stops short. Such intellection requires recognition of the dawnum discussed previously. In order for this sort of cognition to arise, one must be willing to recognize that one's knowing is itself the result of an awareness of a good that transcends all the goods that can be thought about discursively. At this sixth and highest level, the noetic rather than the dianoetic power, the intellectus rather than the radio, has sovereign resonance. At this level, theoria, or contemplatio, is the mode of grasping what is the true source for knowing and understanding. Bloom's taxonomy simply doesn't admit this sort of cognitive activity, which transcends all systematizations of thought, as well as all critical, analytic, synthetic, and evaluative thinking. Okay? Apart from cutting off the sixth level of contemplation, Bloom's denial of noesis hobbles thinking at each of the lower levels, since noetic activity and intellectus move throughout this hierarchy as well, and not solely at the highest end. For instance, even at the first level in the medieval taxonomy, right down there at the bottom, right? Even at that first level, wherein the things of sense are considered by the mind, you're thinking about something that you've just sensed or felt, right? Wisdom may be pursued noetically. Right? You can ask questions, philosophic questions, based on your senses. Do you see? Noesis may, even at this lowest level, take the things of sense upwards towards their true beginning in the divine arche. And the intellect may certainly gaze upon being at any of these levels in the contemplative taxonomy. Critical, analytic, synthetic, or evaluative thought need not be the only way in which the mind deals with its thought objects, contrary to what Bloom's taxonomy suggests. Yet another way to evaluate Bloom's taxonomy in light of the ancient and medieval taxonomies that incorporate the pursuit of wisdom is to inspect his ordering according to the three movements of the soul discussed by Thomas and originating in the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius. In the Divine Names, Dionysius speaks about three sorts of movements: circular, that is movement around a stationary point; straight, movement proceeding from one point to another; and spiral, being the combination of the other two. Thomas clarifies these three movements as they apply to human beings. Each of the three movements is broken down by Thomas into its respective components. The circular movement of the soul consists of several things, of which the first is the withdrawal of the soul into itself from external things. The second is a certain concentration of its powers, whereby the soul is freed from error and outward occupation. And the third is union with those things that are above the soul. This uniform circular movement is not readily available to human beings without the correction of what Thomas calls a twofold dissimilarity. The first is that which arises from the diversity of external things, and this requires that the soul withdraw from external things. Second, the human soul operates using the discursus of reasoning in order for the uniform circular movement to be achieved. All operations of the soul must be directed to the simple contemplation of intelligible truth. Once reasoning ceases, the soul's gaze may be fixed on the contemplation of one simple truth. This sort of cognitive activity puts everything else aside and involves the dedication of oneself solely to the contemplation and the pursuit of wisdom. Thomas remarks, moreover, that in this circular motion of the soul, there is no error. That's an interesting point, folks. There's no error in the circular contemplative motion of the soul. Just as there is no error in the knowledge of the first principles, which we know by simple intuition. Okay, you just grasp the mind, just grasps them. There can be no error. Studying Thomas's articulation of the soul's circular movement, we can now see how foreign it is to the taxonomy of educational objectives that drives instruction in our classrooms. Whereas Bloom's ordering stresses the cultivation of discursive, analytic, synthetic, and evaluative capacities, the circular movement calms these learning priorities, seeking their effective cessation. Whereas reasoning and classroom thinking, and for teachers, the evaluation of student achievement, involves the measurement and progression of rational capacities according to certain skill sets in thinking and cognitive development, the circular movement of the soul cannot be so evaluated, since by its nature it's separate from all discursus, and it is free of error. The circular movement has no measure other than the measure in which it participates by pursuing wisdom in contemplative gazing. Bloom's taxonomy is unable to account for this psychic movement, and not surprisingly, our own educational biases, modeled as they are on accountability and learning, measurements, standardized testing, and assessment for learning, do not recognize, let alone cultivate, such cognitive activities, even though such activities constitute the highest happiness for human beings, according to all the ancient medieval taxonomies discussed in our own study. Next, Thomas indicates that the straight movement of the soul is not one thing but twofold. First, during such a movement, the soul goes out to those things that are around it. Second, it is raised from external things to simple contemplation. Put another way, the straight movement of the soul proceeds from external objects of the sense to the knowledge of intelligible realities, from point A to point B. The straight motion of the soul, in this way, moves from externals of sense towards intelligible realities discursively, right, from point to point to point. And through discursus, it reaches towards non-discursive reality, apprehended through contemplation in the circular motion. Similarly, Thomas speaks of the spiral movement of the soul as arising from the fact that the soul is enlightened in divine truths in a manner proper to reason and about many things. So the spiral movement is said to exist in a soul inasmuch as it uses divine revelation in reasoning. Put another way, when the soul reasons, For reasoning is linear, moving from point to point. Using the insights of theoria concerning primary or non-discursive reality, it moves in a spiral fashion. Anyway, all three of these motions of the intellect are jeopardized or denied by Bloom's taxonomy. Let me explain this to you. Interestingly, whereas before it appeared that only the circular movement of the soul would be denied by strict adherence to Bloom's taxonomy, we can now clearly see that all three movements are jeopardized, inasmuch as each is either the embodiment of the circular, as contemplatio or theoria, or is directed toward the circular, like the straight moves towards the circular, right? Or it makes use of insights gleaned from circular motions of the soul, as in the form of the spiral, see? In this way, by denying credence to one motion of the soul, the circular, all other motions that Bloom argues must be fostered and recognized in a fully educational program of teaching and learning are thrown into doubt. Over the years, Bloom's taxonomy has become the standard by which we measure student learning and organize classroom teaching. Bloom's taxonomy is used to ensure that our teaching and learning is sufficiently diversified to reach into all the broadly recognized levels of learning. However, this same taxonomy sweeps aside contemplative movements of the soul or intellect as irrelevancies. As we've seen in our study of Thomas's writings, the circular movement of contemplation that is central to the pursuit of wisdom is free of error. It's therefore not susceptible to assessment. For assessment only makes sense where error exists, right? Not going to assess where there can be no error, no right or wrong. Given the hypertrophied emphasis in today's schools on assessment and accountability, what cannot be assessed is quickly pushed out of the way in the busyness of the classroom. And you see that? So, a few remarks on notions of creativity as they relate to Bloom's taxonomy versus ancient or medieval taxonomies, right? Here's your modern notion of creativity. There's the Bloomian taxonomy. Lots of times what people do is they talk about creating at the top of the taxonomy here, right? Creating arises through the cultivation of Noetic capacities of the radio. That's lots of times how we talk about it nowadays. You become creative through learning how to do all these other things. But, that being modern, what's ancient and medieval creativity? Well, it involves not the ratcheting up of critical analytic skills, but the quieting of such skills in discursive reasoning. See, you're quieting these things down. The discursive reasoning that we all treasure so much, you're quieting it. It involves using the reasoning, the straight line or the spiral, as a means towards an expression or an expression of the pure contemplative movement or the circular. It involves leaving behind all about which one might reason, all finitude, all variety, change, multiplicity, all limited goods and desires associated with mortal aims. That doesn't sound like modern creativity, does it? That's what we mean in the ancient sense, in medieval sense. Creativity from this line involves emptying the self of its own will, of its desires. It's the art of dying, folks. That's what Plato calls philosophy, or immortalizing as Plato calls it, right? This is creativity. In order to be creative, you have to kind of disappear here. Your mortal aspect has to disappear, that the immortal part shines out. That's what art is. The artist embodies creativity through losing himself or herself, through transcending mortal nature and participating in what is divine, or immortal. Do you see how weird this is compared to, old Sir Ken? To recap then, in ancient or medieval thought, creativity only arises as an aspect of divinity. We talked about that in our very first lecture, the introductory lecture on creativity. To be creative, we must overcome our mortal nature. We must overcome we, or ourselves. We must cease to be as mortal or finite beings. We must realize that we are not what is. This involves loss of self, or self-will, or self-concern, or self-consciousness. We cultivate attention to what is by relinquishing or being released from all our other concerns, our interests, desires, aims, our ambitions, all these other things that get in the way of our awareness of what is. In order to pursue wisdom, we must, as Plato says, practice this art of dying. By dying to the mortal self, we simultaneously immortalize, according to Aristotle. And the extent to which we immortalize is the extent of our creativity. I've bold-faced that for you. The extent to which we immortalize is the extent of our creativity. Only to this extent will whatever we create truly be the result of creativity, or a divine attribute, the fruit of wisdom. Okay, so I'm suggesting then that perhaps a lot of what we call creativity is in some way an image of creativity, but maybe it's not, in the ancient or medieval sense, really creativity. It's something different. So next I want to just read to you an excerpt from a book that some of you I'm sure are familiar with. It's called Zen and the Art of Archery. It's kind of a classic. Eastern and Western traditions both stress the importance of noesis, or contemplative seeing, or thinking that seeks beyond all that can be thought or discursively apprehended for the ground of wisdom. Philosophy, contemplation, meditation, and the Zen arts are all practices designed to lessen the hold of our finite desires, our thoughts, our feelings, our self-will, our sense of self-importance and inherent existence. In his book, Zen and the Art of Archery, the German philosopher Hegel briefly recounts his many years of study in the art of Japanese archery. In this excerpt, Hegel writes about the importance of the activity of cultivating a Zen awareness of emptiness in relation to the artistic or creative act. Let me read some of this to you right now. He writes, "The first step along this road had already been taken. It had led to a loosening of the body, without which the bow cannot be properly drawn. If the shot is to be loosened right, the physical loosening must now be continued in a mental and spiritual loosening, so as to make the mind not only agile but free. Agile because of its freedom, and free because of its original agility. And this original agility is essentially different from everything that is usually understood by mental agility. Thus, between these two states of bodily relaxedness on the one hand and spiritual freedom on the other, there is a difference of level which cannot be overcome by breath control alone, but only by withdrawing from all attachments whatsoever, by becoming utterly egoless, so that the soul, sunk within itself, stands in the plenitude of its nameless origin." Don't forget, this is the art of archery, right? This is a creative art. The demand that the door of the senses be closed is not met by turning energetically away from the sensible world, but rather by a readiness to yield without resistance. In order that this actionless activity may be accomplished instinctively, the soul needs an inner hold, and it wins it by concentrating on breathing. This is performed consciously and with a conscientiousness that borders on the pedantic. The breathing in, like the breathing out, is practiced again and again by itself with the utmost care. One does not have to wait long for results. The more one concentrates on breathing, the more the external stimuli fade into the background. They sink away in a kind of muffled roar, which one hears with only half an ear at first, and in the end one finds it no more disturbing than the distant roar of the sea, which, once one has grown accustomed to it, is no longer perceived. In due course, one even grows immune to larger stimuli, and at the same time detachment from them becomes easier and quicker. Care is only to be taken that the body is relaxed, whether standing, sitting, or lying. And if one then concentrates on breathing, one soon feels oneself shut in by impermeable layers of silence. One only knows and feels that one breathes, and to detach oneself from this feeling and knowing, no fresh decision is required, for the breathing slows down of its own accord, becomes more and more economical in the use of breath, and finally, slipping by degrees into a blurred monotone, escapes one's attention altogether. This exquisite state of unconcerned immersion in oneself is not, unfortunately, of long duration. It's liable to be disturbed from the inside. As though sprung from nowhere, moods, feelings, desires, worries, and even thoughts incontinently rise up in a meaningless jumble. And the more far-fetched and preposterous they are, and the less they have to do with that on which one has fixed one's consciousness, the more tenaciously they hang on. I'm sure some of you who have tried meditation have had that happen too, right? Regularly. It is as though they wanted to avenge themselves on consciousness for having, through concentration, touched upon realms it would otherwise never reach. The only successful way of rendering this disturbance inoperative is to keep on breathing, quietly and unconcernedly, to enter into friendly relations with whatever appears on the scene, to accustom oneself to it, to look at it equably, and at last grow weary of looking. In this way, one gradually gets into a state which resembles the melting drowsiness on the verge of sleep. Just don't fall asleep when you're meditating, right? To slip into it, finally, is the danger that has to be avoided. It is met by a peculiar leap of concentration, comparable perhaps to the jolt which a man who has stayed up all night gives himself when he knows that his life depends on all his senses being alert. And if this leap has been successful but a single time, it can be repeated with certainty. With its help, the soul is brought to the point where it vibrates of itself in itself, a serene pulsation which can be heightened into a feeling otherwise experienced only in rare dreams of extraordinary lightness, and the rapturous certainty of being able to summon up energies in any direction, to intensify or to release tensions graded to a nicety. This state, in which nothing definite is thought, planned, striven for, desired or expected, which aims in no particular direction and yet knows itself capable alike of the possible and the impossible, so unswerving is its power. This state, which is at bottom purposeless and egoless, was called by the Master truly spiritual. It is in fact charged with spiritual awareness, and is therefore also called right presence of mind. This means that the mind or spirit is present everywhere, because it is nowhere attached to any particular place. And it can remain present because even when related to this or that object, it doesn't cling to it by reflection, and thus lose its original mobility, like water filling a pond, which is always ready to flow off again. It can work its inexhaustible power because it's free, and be open to everything because it's empty. This state is essentially a primordial state, and its symbol, the empty circle, is not empty of meaning for him who stands within it. Out of the fullness of this presence of mind, disturbed by no ulterior motive, the artist, who is released from all attachment, must practice his art. But if he is to fit himself self-effacingly into the creative process, the practice of the art must have the way smoothed for it. For if, in his self-immersion, he saw himself faced with a situation into which he could not leap instinctively, he would first have to bring it to consciousness. He would then enter again into all the relationships from which he had himself detached. He would be like one awakened, who considers his program for the day, but not like an awakened one who lives and works in the primordial state. It would never appear to him as if the individual parts of the creative process were being played into his hands by a higher power. He would never experience how intoxicatingly the vibrancy of an event is communicated to him, who is himself only a vibration, and how everything that he does is done before he knows it. The necessary detachment and self-liberation, the inward turning and intensification of life until full presence of mind is reached, are therefore not left to chance or to favorable conditions, the less so as the more depends on them, and least of all are they abandoned to the process of creation itself, which already demands all the artist's powers, in the hopes that the desired concentration will appear of its own accord. Before all doing and creating, before ever he begins to devote and adjust himself to his task, the artist summons forth his presence of mind and makes sure of it through practice. But from the time he succeeds in capturing it, not merely at rare intervals, but in having it at his fingertips in a few moments, the concentration, like the breathing, is brought into connection with archery. In order to slip more easily into the process of drawing the bow and loosing the shot, the archer, kneeling to one side and beginning to concentrate, rises to his feet, ceremoniously steps up to the target, and, with a deep obeisance, offers the bow and arrow like consecrated gifts, then nocks the arrow, raises the bow, draws it, and waits in an attitude of supreme spiritual alertness. After the lightning release of the arrow and the tension, the archer remains in the posture adopted immediately following the shot until, after slowly expelling his breath, he is forced to draw air again. Then only does he let his arm sink, bows to the target, and if he has no more shots to discharge, steps quietly into the background. Archery thus becomes a ceremony, which exemplifies the great doctrine. Even if the pupil does not, at this stage, grasp the true significance of his shots, he at least understands why archery cannot be a sport, a gymnastic exercise. He understands why the technically learnable part of it must be practiced to the point of repletion. If everything depends on the archer's becoming purposeless and effacing himself in the event, then its outward realization must occur automatically, in no further need of the controlling or reflecting intelligence. We can take up any questions or comments you have on this portion of the lectures in class. Thank you for your attention.